So hey, how's it going? Long time no see. This is the first video in a while where I've just been talking to you directly, and it's coming up in a couple days on my 1 year anniversary of Man v Mob and me having left my job last summer. It was on June 7th. And so I have some different ideas that I want to talk about, some things that I think that you'll find interesting. Some of it's a little bit deep, but it's stuff that I have really wanted to get into for a while. So first, I just want to say that the last year has been incredible. It has had its ups and downs. I've done dumb things. I've done um, rewarding things. I've done all kinds of different things. Some of the dumb things have been rewarding. Some of them have just been funny. I got a new vehicle. The first truck that I got was a complete lemon. And then I had to get another truck. That was my fault. I wasn't very good at doing the research that I needed to do, but I paid the price for that, and it made a pretty good story. So the truck that I have now has been great. It's got the logo on the side of it. Let's see, over the summer, last summer, I got a radio station, and I'd been doing that for a while, and that's been put on hold because of the quarantine. That was really cool. I really liked the aspect where I could talk to people and get their feedback and get their input directly on the radio, that I could have a line directly to people that were listening. So that was really awesome, and I'm going to pursue more of that once we move past quarantine, whenever that is. Um, so with the podcast itself, I have had great conversations with people that I never expected to talk to. First of all, a lot of friends who have been willing to come on, and I sincerely appreciate that. Some people who I talk with all the time, but I've never talked with at a deeper level, and that has been really cool. And also people who I haven't talked with since high school, which I've gotten to know them in an entirely new way as well. And people who, let's see, I've talked with a couple authors, some subject matter experts. So I've spoken with Diane Mulcahy, who wrote The Gig Economy. And if you remember way back, that was one of the books that caused me to resign my job as a mechanical engineer. Pretty influential. So I actually had her on the podcast. I spoke with John Hargrave, who wrote a book about Bitcoin, about blockchain, called Blockchain for Everyone. That was a very interesting conversation. And more recently, I've gotten a lot of people on who I just don't think that I would have been able to reach them otherwise, because the quarantine really put everybody at home and made them more accessible. So one of those is Daryl Davis. And if you don't know who he is an activist and an advocate. He is a blues musician slash jazz musician, and he currently does, I guess you could call it, outreach. So Daryl's a black man who goes and talks with different members of the Ku Klux Klan, current members, and he's convinced about 100, maybe 150 people directly to leave the Klan. He's got a closet full of robes that people have handed into him. And I think he really speaks to the power of redemption, regardless of really what somebody's beliefs are, or if they've traveled down a morally reckless road. So there was Daryl, there was Zoltan Istvan, who is a futurist. He talks about transhumanism and artificial intelligence, genetic modification, cyborg modification, all the things that are coming up. And that was pretty compelling. Gerald Posner, who wrote a fantastic book about pharma, and the book itself is called Pharma: Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. It came out in March, and we talked about the history of the pharmaceutical industry. Why are we living with massive pharmaceutical companies, and why are prescription drugs so expensive? Stuff like that. Gerald is great. I recommend that you check out his content on YouTube and some of his other books. He's written fascinating books about Joseph Mengele, the Nazi death camp doctor, about the Oklahoma City bomber, about the JFK assassination, Martin Luther King assassination, the Vatican Bank, um, all kinds of different things. He's really, he started out as a lawyer, but he's really an investigative journalist. So definitely check out his books. And I actually also spoke with his wife, who also happens to be an author, about her book, which is called The Pharmacist of Auschwitz. And that is about Victor Capesius, who became the, as you would guess, the pharmacist of Auschwitz during the later years of World War II during the final solution. And that was really the first I had ever heard of him. And I have made fascinating connections through her work and through her husband's work to other topics. Somebody recently pointed out to me that they sent me a video clip of an Indian activist saying that American billionaires are picking up where the chemical company Monsanto has left off. So if you don't know Monsanto, they create agricultural chemicals like Roundup is the popular one. It's a weed killer. And what are the effects that these chemicals are having on the human body over time, not just by themselves, but in combination. So it's almost like what Rachel Carson said in Silent Spring. So this Indian lady was talking about how American billionaires like Bill Gates, through his foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they are causing third world or developing nations to effectively use large agricultural pesticides, large amounts of agricultural pesticides in pursuit of a goal that was set. And what she says was that a lot of people don't realize that these chemicals have roots in Nazi Germany. And that is a connection to exactly what Tricia Posner says in her book, The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, where she's talking about how German pharmaceutical company IG Farben actually put a massive plant next to the Auschwitz concentration camp, which was 3 camps, and they used slave labor, Jews who were at the camp, as well as tested their products on Jews in the camp. So what she brought up in the book was how there was a subsidiary of IG Farben, and by the way, IG Farben is still around, but there was a subsidiary, I think the name was Dagesh, and they produced a chemical called Zyklon B. And the Nazis, later on in the war, they said, we want you to effectively change the label of this pesticide, Zyklon B, get rid of this information that calls it a pesticide, and up the production. And that's what they used in the gas chambers during the final solution. So it's interesting how things can connect together, because effectively chemicals that were used for weapons for the murder of people after the war, their production would have ceased. Making these chemicals made people a lot of money, and they essentially transferred a lot of these chemicals. I'm not saying Zyklon B, but they transferred a lot of these chemicals for use as agricultural chemicals. And the effect could be all different types of health issues, cancer, whatever, that could explain why rates of cancer are so high today, partly. So anyway, who else have I spoken with? Recently, I spoke with, thinking of authors here. Oh, this was a really good one. I spoke with Stephen Hassan. If you don't know who he is, he's a cult expert. One of the things that I've been wanting to talk about since I started this was cults and scams, and more recently I've added on mind control in general. And I have learned a lot about the prevalence of those. I've spoken with somebody who was in a scam, a multi-level marketing scam. If you're unfamiliar with Amway, it's a pretty large MLM scam, I recommend watching the um, John Oliver piece on multi-level marketing. It's pretty eye-opening and also pretty hilarious. And there's so many of these. Think about all the supplement scams that you see on YouTube. People trying to say, "Hey, man, try this. It'll increase the number of your ATP uptake and the number of mitochondria in your cells or whatever." You go, "What the hell are you talking about? Do you even know what you're selling?" So check out the number of scams in the episode "United We Scam," where I spoke with Luke and he talked about his experience in this group. It's almost like a fraternity mixed with what you would see in The Wolf of Wall Street, mixed with your classic definition of a pyramid scheme. So the proliferation of scams and cults, I think, is largely a result of people's lack of satisfaction at home, at work, with them, their sense of identity. I'm kind of pursuing that, and how generationally identity has shifted. And I really recommend that you check out the video and the audio of what I recorded with Stephen Hassan, who himself was in a group called the Moonies, a cult back in the 70s, and they're still around today. And there are so many cults, about 3,000 active cults, and some of them are pretty darn large. Scientology, Jehovah's Witnesses, and how he defines cult, because it's always important to have an idea of what the word means before you start launching into a conversation about the thing. His definition of cult is using mind control and undue influence to manipulate people in an unethical, negative way. So, there are some methods of mind control that are positive, like if you're trying to get somebody to stop smoking, maybe, or to recover from substance abuse, maybe something like that. But there are a lot of really shady mind control methods that are used. And unfortunately, back when this was discovered in the 50s and 60s, when psychology was really looking into this stuff as a profession, it was still sort of contained within the profession and used definitely unethically by government and by corporations, but it wasn't just given out to the public for use. It's an amoral system, mind control. So now it's given, these tips are given out on YouTube videos and whatnot. So you get things like pickup artists and people starting their own scams, things like that. But it is massive. I will say that. I will say that this goes far deeper than you would ever expect. I had a interesting moment in the conversation with Stephen Hassan where I asked, do you think the reason why the government doesn't pursue this more, these unethical uses of mind control, do you think it's because that the government itself has a history with this? And there's actually evidence of it. If you've never heard of MK Ultra before, it was a program that the CIA was running back in the 60s and 70s, where they were attempting to figure out how to control people's minds. They were inspired by what was done to prisoners of war during the Korean War, as well as what the Chinese communists were doing. So they wanted to figure out if they could do it themselves. The cover was they wanted to see if they could use it on spies that were caught, things like that. But it was used, effectively, LSD was used on civilians. And two of the, I don't know all of the details of this, I'm still researching it, but Joe Rogan has talked to us about this a bunch of times too. But effectively, both the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, and Charles Manson were a part of MK Ultra. They were tested on, and then they were just sort of released into the public, or they had a bad experience with it. They had some degree of PTSD that might have played into their eventual crimes. It's unclear. So there's that. And then there's also, we talk about this. This is something that Stephen had recommended to me. There's a documentary called The Century of Self. And I highly recommend you watch it. It's a fairly long documentary. If you watch all 4 episodes, it's about 3.5 or 4 hours long, but you can find it on YouTube. And what they say in the documentary is how coming out of World War II, where you had instances of just almost insanity, population level insanity, like in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and previously, decades earlier, with the revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the establishment of the Soviet Union. And so the Western democracies, particularly the United States, were concerned that this could happen here, and that the population was sort of a ticking time bomb. And what led to this was the belief in what Freud was saying. Freud was very popular at the time in the US, and he was saying that every person has a subconscious, and the subconscious is filled with desires for violence and sexuality and mob justice and things like that. So the people in the government officials, president, whatever, they were concerned that this could happen with everyday citizens, American citizens. So effectively, what they asked for was a program that would make sure that people made the right decisions. It was sort of influenced democracy. And I know this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but there's a man named Edward Bernays. He was popular. He wasn't really popular, but he really got his start back during World War One. And he was brought in because in World War One, Woodrow Wilson had run on a promise not to get the United States into the war. We were supposed to be isolationist. And then at some point, he got information that said effectively, we're not going to get our money back from all of the loans that we've made the British and our other allies unless we enter the war effort. So for financial reasons, largely, I'm sure there's a host of other reasons, we had to get into World War One. So it was put on this man, Edward Bernays' shoulders to go out and to convince the American public that it was in their best interest to go to war, and that it was the patriotic thing to do. And so that was really the start of his career. He was very successful at it. And he ultimately became effectively, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of, or if you've ever seen Mad Men, but it's a show about Madison Avenue. And Madison Avenue is a street in New York where the advertising agencies are. This was big in the 50s. So Edward Bernays was actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the American nephew. And so he used a lot of his uncle's thinking and psychological lessons, essentially, on the crowd mind and the individual mind. So what he wanted to do, and what he was asked to do, is to effectively switch people from being active citizens to docile, passive consumers. And that was the birth in the 1950s, after World War II, of modern consumer culture. So the idea is, if you don't have an individual identity, you can buy one. And advertising, marketing would stoke people's insecurities so that they would consume more to fill the gaps in their lives, whether in sort of the whole keeping up with the Joneses mentality. And we've ultimately been living by that ever since. And now it's on steroids with Instagram and influencer culture and things like that. But the modern American life of the engine is consume, 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 which causes growth, 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 or else collapse. That really started in that era. And it's a little bit creepy to think that, you know, our parents' generation and our generation indirectly has been really controlled in a way. Influence is a nicer way to say controlled, but we've been steered towards certain decisions. And so Edward Bernays came up with the idea of public relations, and he said that effectively every organization, government or corporate, private, whatever, every group with an agenda should have a public relations expert who should effectively come up with talking points, which would be the news. And they would then give those to journalists. So anytime a journalist had a question, they would go to the PR person of that organization and they would get their information. And so, uh, you know, unfortunately, that's part of the situation that we're living in today with our media. I don't really think it's the best quality. I think it effectively just gives you pieces of information that powerful entities want you to consume. And I'm not saying that as a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. There's definitely incentives, particularly with advertisers, to basically tell you what the news is. So this is all interesting stuff. It's extremely relevant. And I think that you will start to see, if you watch and listen to some of the episodes that I've been putting out over the last year, and I'll continue to make connections and have new conversations, but I think you'll start to see that they interconnect in ways that you wouldn't expect. Um, Another topic that I really haven't gotten into yet, but which I'd like to talk about right now, is intelligence, and really what I think its impact is and how it's going to be increasingly more important. So when I say intelligence, a lot of people conflate intelligence and knowledge, and I think this is actually a problem because we sort of skirt around the fact that they're different. So when you say that intelligence is knowledge, you're saying that effectively you can make somebody smarter by educating them more. And you can, I think everybody has sort of a range in which their brain can operate, in that, like, if somebody is deprived of education but they have a brain that that is more capable of interpreting information, I think that they might be better off than, or I know that they might be better off than if somebody were to have a brain that was less capable of processing information, but they were given the best education. So the point is that a lot of people have been pushed into college education as, hey, this is the be all end all, when they shouldn't have necessarily gotten a college education, because this advice that's being given was advice that was, it made a lot of sense maybe 50 years ago when jobs were easier to come by and they had less of a cognitive load. So the issue today is that increasingly more and more work involves high cognitive ability, particularly work that you would find in, say, technology, coding. What we're realizing is that life is far more complex than we had originally thought it was, and we were reducing it into simple, understandable narratives. That's how the human brain generally works, is it reduces all of the complexity, all of the different causes. There might be 1,000 different contributing causes to one thing, and we reduce it to the most obvious, to what we saw. So for example, if somebody runs over a nail in the road and gets a flat tire, we say, okay, obviously the causation here is there was a nail in the road. That's why there's a flat. But we don't see all of the things that contributed to that nail being in the road, that car, that particular tire being there at that particular moment. So the point is, intelligence is going to be far, far more important as the cognitive ability required in this vastly changing economy goes up and up and up. And the implications of that are that people who are below a certain cognitive threshold are not going to be able to, and that threshold's going to keep rising, by the way, are not going to be able to find work. It's just not, unless we commit to effectively creating jobs, make work, 100% employment, which was the policy of the Soviet Union. And that's why they had 4, 5 people in a bake shop that had to give a customer the loaf of bread that they ordered, or whatever. If they would have 20 people on a work crew, a ton of labor. I mean, you think about unions at their worst. Unions are conceived in that they give benefits to laborers that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get, because as a collective, they're able to bargain better. But at their worst, effectively what it does is it adds intense inefficiency to the process, because you don't actually need that many people, and it sort of punishes the most productive. It pushes down productivity. I'm not saying productivity is the end goal. I'm actually concerned that that we live at a time that it sort of is amoral and ignores people and their needs. It's like we've been stuck with the greed is good mentality ever since the 80s, Gordon Gekko and Wall Street. And I think that it's really important that we consider how we actually address intelligence, and how it's going to be effectively the new dividing line in society, and how we compassionately, humanely deal with people that no longer have economic utility, economic value, but still have human value. So when I say that I think that intelligence is going to be the new dividing line in society, I've been influenced in this by Noah Yuval Harari's books, Sapiens, Homo Deus, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, where he's saying people who are less intelligent are effectively going to be one of the biggest problems of the future, in the sense of, like, if you have a massive population that no longer serves an economic purpose, how do you manage that? How do you allow those people to live their lives and contribute to society if they're cut off from their income? Because we live at a point in time where culturally we encourage people to get most of not only their income from employment, like selling their time for money, but also to get their sense of purpose from their vocation as well. So if you cut somebody off from employment, they not only have no money, and they can't sustain themselves, because nobody can subsist anymore really. Nobody's or very few people are growing their own food and hunting and things like that. So you end up with somebody who effectively can't take care of themselves unless they have a source of income, and who don't have a sense of purpose. And that's why you see huge spikes in things like opioid abuse. When you see towns that have lost their manufacturing or their major source of pride, of economic opportunity, that's what you're seeing. So if you think about the 20th century, I know a lot of people aren't really that into history. I'm a huge fan of history, but the 3 big dividers were class, race, and nationality. And you saw class in the forefront with communism, with the ideas of Karl Marx saying that people were divided by social class. And you saw nationality at play with fascism. And for those of you who don't know what fascism actually is, and this is a huge problem, is that a lot of these terms that are used today, people use them frequently but don't define them, or they don't know what they mean, or they think they know what they mean. So fascism isn't just somebody being controlling or aggressive or authoritarian. That's part of fascism. It's not, fascism isn't just corporations that control government. That can be a part of fascism. Fascism is ultimately the belief that countries exist in a state of competition, of natural Darwinian competition, just like individual organisms do, and that it's in the best interest of a nation to be as efficient as possible and to effectively be managed in a way that makes them the most dominant organism that will survive in a survival of the fittest situation. So that's what fascism is all about. It's a scientific, Darwinian, pseudoscientific, Darwinian view of life at the national level. So the third category that we saw dividing in the 20th century was race, and that was obviously played out in Nazi Germany, where Hitler took the fascist idea to the next level and said that actually we're divided even further by our skin color / genetic attributes, and he had a harsh line between the groups. So obviously some people still haven't moved past that view, but I think a lot of people have realized that you can't actually divide people that easily between the nation or race or class. And I think that what we're starting to see, what some people have actually realized, and what some people are kind of uncomfortably orbiting around, is this idea that intelligence is increasingly going to determine how effective you are in the working world and the opportunities that come your way. And I think it explains a lot of the what do you want to call it? The income inequality. You hear this a lot, politicians talking about income inequality. I think that intelligence contributes heavily to that. And when you even say something like intelligence is important, you sound like an elitist, or you sound like somebody who is a supremacist or something like that. And that's actually not what I'm trying to say. And I don't mean to sound like arrogant or anything like that. I actually think that effectively, so I don't think that intelligence is just genetic. I think there's a genetic and a environmental component to it. I don't know exactly the, you know, the breakdown, but I think that it's a mistake when somebody believes that they are totally a victim. I think that the victimhood mentality is flawed, but I also think that the supremacy mentality is flawed, because a lot of the uncomfortable truth is that a lot of life is determined by random chance. So, somebody's intelligence, you can't take credit for if you have high intelligence, or you can't blame anyone or feel bad, like in the sense of that it's something that you did if you don't have high intelligence. So this is where I think we ultimately need to come together and say, like, there's no, these people are inherently better, these people are inherently worse. That sort of, what do you want to call it? Chauvinism, that racial and ethnic chauvinism that existed in the 20th century. I don't want that to exist around intelligence. And I think that people need to be humane, and that, just because somebody got the shorter end of the stick doesn't mean that they should be made to suffer. So that's why I believe there should be something like a universal basic income that effectively provides a basic threshold necessity for people as they get locked out of the job market. We need to prepare for this. And intelligence is going to, even the people at the top who are most intelligent are going to be threatened by artificial intelligence, because that's going to think in a way that humans do not think at all. So if you look at really human development over the last couple hundred years, we first had the realization that humans don't occupy the center of the universe. We used to think that everything revolved around Earth. And actually, we realized that Earth revolves around the sun. So that was sort of the first blow to the human ego. And then the second blow was when we thought that we were God's chosen creature and that we existed in this privileged position. And we realized that we actually don't. We're just one branch of ape, basically. We're one branch of primate out of many, and we're the most creative, and we certainly dominate in the space of being able to share narratives and be creative and use tools and things like that. But we're one species among many. And the third thing that we're going to realize, which is going to be very humbling, and we're in the midst of it right now, the third paradigm shift, is that we're actually not as intelligent as we formerly thought. Like we're not, the world isn't entirely comprehensible to the human brain. And we used to think that knowledge was just this thing that you could accumulate, and there might be, like if you learned about a topic, a single topic like World War II, once you read all the books about it, that was it. That was, you now knew about World War II. But that's actually not the case. Any single topic is infinitely complex and opens up more and more questions. So the way that knowledge works is you actually, the more you learn, the less you know. It's rather paradoxical. So somebody thinks that somebody who maybe isn't very well read thinks that somebody who is well read knows the most, when in reality, that person knows the least. If that makes sense, they've read a lot, but they actually know very little, because knowing implies certainty. And when you read a lot, particularly if you read a varied number of sources, everything challenges everything else, and you have to reconcile all these things, and it becomes infinitely complex. So that's where that phrase "ignorance is bliss" comes from. I believe that, and I also believe knowledge is power. Ignorance is bliss, but knowledge is power. So sort of pick your poison, I guess. But with intelligence, part of what has affected my thinking, I've read a couple books about it, and it's the human brain is extremely complex, and I am very much against believing that you can reduce complexity into a single value. And the human mind wants to do this all the time. It wants to reduce massive complexity into a simple formula, a simple variable, a simple whatever. One example is the Vietnam War. General Westmoreland, when he was communicating to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and LBJ, was using body counts as a single metric for success in the war. And when you reduce something as complex as the Vietnam War to a single metric, which isn't even a very well chosen metric, by the way, then it skews everything. So the administration thought that things were going extremely well because we were stacking up bodies in Vietnam. In reality, like, we had no idea what we were doing. Things were a mess. Another example, GDP. The person who came up with GDP actually said, this is a terrible tool for measuring the economy. Don't use this. And that's been our main indicator of economic health for the last 60 years, 70 years, whatever. And you need a series of metrics to define the health of the economy. And even then, still there's going to be most of the connections and little things that, if you flick one switch, it has this effect that you can't understand. Most of the effects are still going to be invisible and impossible to comprehend to humans, because we have brains that create narratives and causation, and we say this caused that. No, it actually, just because it's obvious and we think it did doesn't mean. Okay, let me give you an example. With causation. Um, so as I, over a year, I get 1 year older and gas prices go up. Does that mean that me getting older is causing gas prices to go up? Just because there's two things are happening simultaneously doesn't mean that one causes the other. But we make this mistake all the time. The third thing that you can't reduce is the human brain itself. And I think that we are so up shit creek on this one when it comes to our presumptions about human intelligence and the brain, is that we have this idea of IQ. And there's this book called The Bell Curve by Charles Murray. And in the book, it's actually a great book. And I think that Charles Murray researched it very well, but it's very controversial because so he was trying to make claims about intelligence and trying to effectively say that intelligence is extremely important. And I do believe that intelligence is extremely important and is going to become even more important moving forward. However, he made a series of bold claims, and one of which was rather, I mean, I guess you could say a lot of it was controversial, but some of it made it into sort of the general public domain and made people very upset. This book was released back in the 90s. And so the claims were effectively that intelligence can be reified. And reification is when you reduce something to a single value. So he was saying that you can reduce intelligence, the human mind, to a single value. And that the second claim out of four was that it was rankable. So you could just take a series of humans if you knew what their value was and just say, okay, you're first, you're second, you're third, fourth, fifth, down the line. The third claim that was being made was that intelligence was mostly genetic, not environmental. So more nature versus nurture. And then the fourth claim was that it is unalterable. So what you have, you're effectively stuck with. And those are all bold claims. And he uses data in statistics. He has a series of appendices in the book with statistics. And if you go through it all, it actually makes a lot of sense. I think I'm not a statistical expert, but he used pretty good statistical method to come to his conclusions. And by the way, if you're not very good with statistics, I recommend a book by Daryl Huff called How to Lie with Statistics. It shows how statistics are misused all the time. And some people say statistics are for liars. That's bullshit. Statistics aren't for liars. You can also say words are for liars. What's done is different groups with an interest, a specific agenda, manipulate statistics for their use. It doesn't mean all statistics are bullshit. It means that statistics are misused all the time. Okay, so one of the biggest issues that people had with Charles Murray's book is that he says that if you use the data, this massive data set, you can actually see that based on performances of different racial and ethnic groups, that there are differences in average IQs between these groups. Not to speak about the individuals within the groups, but the averages of the groups differed by sometimes even, a full standard deviation. And so that was extremely controversial. And that caused him to be put onto the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate page, where they compile all people who are in the Klan, people who are neo-Nazis, black nationalists, anti-gay groups like the Westboro Baptist Church, whatever. That's what the SPLC compiles, and they put him in their archives. And I have a problem with that because although what he's saying is controversial, and because even though people take what he said and misrepresent it, and they say, oh, okay, well, this is proof that, for example, like white people are smarter than black people, or Jews are the most supreme, or whatever. And first of all, what he was saying was actually more nuanced than that. And second of all, I don't actually like, you have to be able to look at this in a pretty nuanced way. So what he said can be misused. However, um, I don't actually believe that he had racist intentions or anything like that. I believe that what did play into it more was that he's a libertarian and that he believes that large government programs which try to effectively use social engineering are in some ways doomed to failure because they miss inherent differences between humans. So in that regard, I think that he had an affirmation with what his results were saying, and I don't actually think that he deserves to be on the SPLC's hate list. So I read his book, and I've read a bunch of his other books. There's some other great books that he's written. He doesn't just go on that topic alone. Coming Apart, phenomenal book, seriously phenomenal book. He actually has also written a book called In Our Hands about a universal basic income and how, because of human variation, he believes that it's important that if we're going to continue to have a society with freedom, that we should have a safety net that works for people. He doesn't believe the current safety net system has, and actually neither do I. I think it incentivizes things like having kids to get more benefits, not being with a partner to get more benefits, and not trying to get additional. It basically penalizes you for additional income. You'll lose benefits. So that keeps people in a state of poverty. And then people who look at people on welfare, they say, oh, well, those people are lazy. Of course, you're always going to have some lazy people, but you're also seeing people who are incentivized to not work. And I actually believe in a lot of what Charles Murray is saying. However, I went, after I read the bell curve, beyond what he was saying and looked at a book that was critical of the bell curve called The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould. And what Stephen talks about in that book is how it's not actually Murray's statistics and his statistical methods that were flawed in the bell curve. It's his data set, and that can lead to equally terrible conclusions. If you're using data that totally sucks, like, people don't realize if your data, if you're conducting a survey for people and you ask them a bunch of survey questions, people can lie. You can get specific response biases. Like the classic one is the claim that 1 in 4 women on college campuses are raped. The actual number is more like 1 in 40, because when you have a survey that says, have you been raped? You're more likely to get a response from people who have been raped than people who haven't. So that creates a response bias. So if you think that, say you get 300 people responding, and 1/4 of those are people who said, yes, I was, that's going to be an inflated number, likely, because of that response bias. So if you then say, oh, this is a representative sample, probably the 25% of this 300 represents 25% of all women in the college campus. Like that's a bias. That's crappy data. And so Stephen Jay Gould was more critical of Murray and Murray's aims, and he did bring up some fascinating things, like how the person who came up with the idea of IQ actually didn't want it to be used to compare people's relative intelligences. He wanted it to be used to identify people with learning disabilities and to help them. So ironically, this thing was created and it was misused against the wishes of the person that created it. That's actually pretty common. The same thing occurred with the implicit bias test that HR departments are using now. So you're having people being forced to go through, like, microaggression training or what's it like, these kind of woke training sessions that corporate is trying to push, diversity seminars, things like that. So the implicit bias training, the person that created that said, yeah, this test, the results of it don't actually mean anything. Do not use this. And it's been used in all different workforces to try to convince people like, hey, you have this percentage bias or whatever. So when it comes to IQ, what Stephen Gould is saying is this has been an obsession, the idea of ranking, having relative rankings of intelligence for decades and decades, and or centuries even. And he's saying that it's not, he doesn't believe that that intelligence isn't important, or that there isn't differences between people. Or he's not even saying that there isn't a large genetic component to it. But what he's saying is that most people, actually, most reasonable people who argue about intelligence do actually believe that it's like a fairly even split between, or some large split between nature and nurture. And so one of the most interesting things that he was saying is that it's foolish to try to reify human intelligence to a single value. It would be like saying that you want to represent dirt, the quality of dirt, as a single value. So create a dirt factor, which, so you look at something like dirt, it seems very simple, particularly compared to something like the human brain. And it's actually not. There's like potentially infinite factors but probably like 40 main identifiable factors that make dirt and determine its relative quality for growing plants and stuff like that. So to think that you can reduce it to a single value is actually foolish and extremely reductive and filled with error. So he also points out that even though some people claim that, oh, if it's genetic, it can't be fixed, it's unalterable. He points out the example of eyeglasses. Like if you have a genetic eye condition, you can go down to the store and get a $15 pair of eyeglasses and it's fixed for some eye conditions, right? So just because something is genetic or largely genetic doesn't mean that you can't do anything about it. So those are a couple of his important claims. I think that the most interesting and fundamentally important parts of the book, and this is actually, it's a short book, but you have to be able to endure really like looking into it. It's also fairly uncomfortable at certain points. So he talks about how early on in intelligence theory, people were doing things like measuring human skulls. They thought that a very crude idea of intelligence early on was that it was really the size of your brain, and so they wanted to measure the volume on the inside of human skulls. So if you've seen the movie Django Unchained, you've seen this, where Leonardo DiCaprio's character Calvin Candy, he has skulls and he takes them out and he says, oh yeah, the black skull is clearly inferior and the white skull is superior. We know this is nonsense today, but there are people who still claim things like that. But it was interesting because Gould goes through how this guy, Morton, who had this massive skull collection, his technique was to use either buckshot, so little steel balls, or mustard seed. And the steel balls couldn't really pack, but the mustard seed could. So what he would do is he would, pour the mustard seed into the white skull, the black skull, the Asian skull, whatever, the Hispanic skull. I don't know I think it was just white, black, and Asian. But and he would he would tamp down what was in the white skull to fit more actual volume in there, and he wouldn't do that to the other skulls. And what Gould is arguing in the book is he actually believes that this wasn't done consciously, that this was done subconsciously to bias the data. Like he actually says that like the data is so flagrantly doctored that he believes that it was done to further, it's called I can't remember, when you've decided your result before you've undergone the study. But he was saying that that's effectively what was at play here. And so not only that, but any skull that didn't conform to the preconceived notion was left out of the mix. So if there was an abnormally large black skull or an abnormally small white skull, you just leave those out of the sample. So it's like, you can see how doctoring data can, oh, by the way, it's called an a priori assumption. And these early data collection methods were filled with a priori assumptions. Like there was an agenda at play, and that has implications towards the conclusions of the data, really. And by the way, this isn't just, I'm going to get back to this in a second with Morton, but this is throughout science. Like, people have this reverence for science and they don't really understand science. First of all, science is a process that can effectively tear apart anything. So like, nothing is safe with science, really. There's not like a stopping point where it's like, okay, we learned all there is to know from science, or science proved what I believe, so like, we're not going to go any further with science. Science is a process of evolving understanding. And we're starting to realize the limitations of science and the scientific method, and how actually artificial intelligence might produce more results than science could, because human brains, although smart, think in a very particular way. And artificial intelligence, you can just load it with data and it will make correlations between data points that no human brain could ever conceive of. Such abstract correlations, and it will spit out a result like, hey, this person, it's like 97% chance that they'll have cancer. And we're going to be living in a weird situation where there's something that is smarter than us, and we don't know how it's arriving at its conclusions. But if its conclusions actually make sense, then we're going to probably say, okay, and put our faith into this thing, almost like a god. Really, it will be a new form of God, where we say, okay, we'll just have to trust, using faith. Remember faith? That this thing is going to continue to produce results that are beneficial. It's going to be very strange. It's called machine learning, by the way, and it's just not how humans learn. Like I said before, we're very narrative based, and that's how we tend to cooperate and move towards certain goals. Is we fixate on a cause of any effect that we see, and we tell ourselves narratives, stories about what we see. Like, the human brain doesn't process raw data. We blend together what our senses feed into our brain, and we create a story that makes sense to us, a story about ourselves, a story about our environment, a overarching story about a god, or our connectedness as a nation of people, or a currency. This is all in Noah Yuval Harari's book Sapiens. But really, our tendency to believe in shared fictions is what allows us to cooperate and do incredible things and come up with new technologies and things like that. But anyway, back to what I was saying with Morton. So Morton's data was the first data set that was used. This was the idea of simply determining intelligence by the size of somebody's skull. And then later on was the concept of intelligence testing. And so the first intelligence testing relied partly on some of the data and conclusions in prior studies from Morton's era, which were filled with data errors. And it effectively created a battery is a selection of different tests. Effectively, it created a battery of different tests that it gave to the World War I soldier population. And it used the military to its advantage to try to get a single group of people that could take this exam. And the way that it was administered was not consistent. It wasn't like a scientific experiment where it was controlled and consistent. There were tons of different people in the group who didn't, English wasn't their native language. You had administrators who were not clear on how to actually administrate the exam. You had flaws with the questions themselves. It was like all different types of, and then there was like a division of A group and B group, and you sort of have to read that chapter of the book itself to get a feel for it. But the data that came out of this became effectively the data set of choice of record for the psychological profession in regards to intelligence. And there was a point in the psychological profession in like the 50s and the 60s where effectively psychology was seen as a pseudoscience. It wasn't really given much respect because you had things like Freud's theories about the Oedipus complex and penis envy and whatever, and it was just seen as kind of jargon, like it was unrooted and you couldn't prove it. And so there was something at that point in time, physics was held in extremely high regard because it produced things that people could actually see, and that theoretically some of the things improved their lives, some of the things at least maybe not directly improved them, but were awe-inspiring. The biggest example being the atomic and thermonuclear bombs. So physics produced formulas and variables that were simple and elegant, and they were reductive, and you could look at them and say, oh wow, that's beautiful. It's like to an extent it's like, you know, a symphony. It's just well composed and you can see it and you don't really understand it per se, but you say, wow, somebody who's extremely intelligent reduced some physical phenomena to this. And so there was a sense of physics envy where this was seen as the only hard science, along with, well, okay, chemistry and some biology as well, but these were like the hard sciences. And so there was a physics envy, particularly in some of the social sciences that were seen as, social science in general was seen as a pseudoscience. And psychology was part of the social sciences. The others being sociology and, I don't know, you know, things like political science probably. And so there was a major push to try to develop a value to try to quantify what was previously only qualified, I guess, which was previously just sort of explanation that lacked numerical backing. So the idea was we need to push to quantify the human mind. And that's where IQ comes from, is this push, not only for legitimacy in the eyes of the scientific community and some psychologists who really were trying to, like, were pursuing values that, like, if you imagine you're a scientist and your entire career is in pursuit of one value in its truth, such as IQ, you're so invested in it that it, like, if somebody attacks that and says this isn't true or the data doesn't support this, you feel personally attacked. So there's a lot of that at play. There is a lot of scientific reputation invested in a lot of discoveries. And not only that, but I was going to mention this earlier, but what people don't realize about science in the real world is that funding matters. And I'm not saying that all science is inherently compromised, but like, you're going to pursue often the agenda of whoever's paying for your whoever's funding you. So what I was talking about with Morton's skulls also has implications for modern things and major claims that are made with regard to something like climate science. You know, like if you say, hey, our models prove this, It's like, well, what assumptions are you making? How did you gather your data? What is this? What are potential sources of bias? These are all huge questions. So like we tend to put a lot of faith into scientists when scientists are beings. They're human beings. They have flaws just like us. Same thing with doctors, by the way. There's no like everything that formerly was on a mantle, like doctors, scientists, priests, like we're realizing that these are all human beings with flaws. They're all they're all hubristic. So not only was there a push to try to quantify the human mind, but there was also intense interest in a simple test that could be administered by both private industry and the military. The military was thinking, how can we determine whether somebody's going to be good as somebody who just holds a heavy object and isn't given much responsibility versus somebody who is going to be potentially in a management position or a leadership position. Industry is interested, companies are interested for the same reason, for hiring, right? And education is also interested for admissions. So with all of these different interested parties, now there's a financial incentive to produce a test and to not really question it, just kind of push it out. And so what we're left with today is IQ, which is based on something called Spearman's G. And what G is, and this is talked about in the bell curve as well, is a factor of general intelligence. And it's arrived at through making correlation, through basically doing a statistical analysis of correlation coefficients and how I'm a little bit dusty on it, but basically how different mental factors correlate with each other. And you can pull out a trend line from this cloud of data, sort of like a scatter plot. And the line of best fit was effectively determined to be G, but it only captured like, I don't know, 60% of the data. So there's still other potential factors that could be sub-factors of intelligence or different forms or contributing elements of intelligence that aren't IQ. And also what the argument is saying in Gould's book is that this line that was called G, Spearman's G, this general intelligence factor, was just one orientation among many in this cloud of data, which he's just latched onto. And like you could take, it's sort of a meaningless construct, and it might not actually mean anything, but it's all that we have. And I have heard through somebody else explaining, this was a clinical psychologist, Jordan Peterson, was at an event where somebody asked him about intelligence, and he said, in the psychological profession, IQ holds the mantle, and if anything, the IQ is the thing within psychology that is most proven or has the most backing. So if something were to dethrone IQ or prove that IQ was not trustworthy, then everything in psychology would come under question. And I said to myself, well, that would be one reason not to question IQ, particularly if you're in the field of psychology. And if you're not in this field of psychology, a lot of people tend not to be very interested in this stuff. They tend to just say, oh, somebody with a goatee and glasses and a degree said it, so I'm going to trust it. Why should I? So there's sort of that, the power of suggestion heavily at play. And all of our modern testing is largely based off of these theories of the mind, all of standardized testing. So with all of that at play, it's dangerous to question, because then people say, well, if we're that wrong, then we've effectively been condemning people based off of test answers that don't actually mean anything to success or failure. And what we've been seeing is our own influence. So like if somebody is selected, oh, this says you have high IQ, we're going to bring you on board here, you're going to see the Pygmalion effect, where it's self-fulfilling prophecy. If you start to give that person more resources and fast track them, then they're more likely to be successful. I'm not saying that this doesn't accurately get all of the most intelligent people, but I'm saying you're going to get a lot of other people who like maybe really shouldn't be fast tracked as the most promising. And then it's the same thing with people who are put on the slow track, or who are just dismissed as it's called the golem effect, self-fulfilling prophecy in the negative direction. It's like, okay, this person's probably not destined for much, and you then deprive them of resources and it becomes self-fulfilling. So we really need to think about this, because humans have value regardless of what their intelligence is. And intelligence doesn't say anything about your moral content. Intelligence is effectively like your ability to synthesize information and to make rapid decisions, and so you almost have to think of knowledge as like the library in your head of, okay, here's all this information, it's there. But intelligence is how you can use that library and how quickly you can flip between the different books, and how able you are to have numerous books open at once and to cross-reference. And that's the best way that I can describe intelligence, how I think about it. I'm sure many people would disagree with me. So we shouldn't punish people who are intelligent, and we shouldn't publish people who are less intelligent. We should try to create a society that balances and considers both. I am concerned that we take people who are intelligent and we separate them from the general population. So we'll say, oh, this person is gifted. We'll remove them from the public schools or whatever, and we'll sort of fast track them, put them in Mensa or whatever. And that lack of socialization with the cross section of the population means that extremely intelligent people are only around other extremely intelligent people, and they think that they have a biased view, and they think that's the way the world is. And then they're going to start to think about other people who don't share their degree of intelligence effectively as if they are another species. They're going to see them as like those are the seeds of supremacy, and the seeds of cruelty, and the seeds of lack of compassion. And I believe that that a lot of the people who I don't think we're like a pure meritocracy, and you have to even question what the term meritocracy means, because like what it ultimately implies is that people who are the most capable are the ones that are in the positions of power and influence. However, that doesn't mean that they're like, merit to me almost implies that like you earned what you have, where like if you're extremely intelligent, there's nothing earned in that. You just are it. It's like you don't control your nature and nurture, so there's nothing to be proud of there. It's like I'm not saying you can't have individual pride, and like if you do something great in your head, but like there's nothing to brag about there. You didn't do anything to arrive at being a smart person. It's just it just is what it is. And so and it's the same thing with the reverse. If you're not that intelligent, like I said before. But I'm concerned that we have a lot of highly intelligent people, extremely intelligent people, in positions of high finance, in positions of government office, in positions of obviously Silicon Valley as well. But it says nothing about their compassion or their socialization, or whether they care about society as a whole. They could just be in pursuit of their own interests and their own intellect. So I think in Silicon Valley, that manifests itself as people who tend to be on the autism spectrum. Maybe maybe they have Asperger's, who really don't, they get along best with things and ideas and machines and computer screen interface with the human, right? Um, and maybe they don't understand the effects of all these things on society and elsewhere in the country, and what engineered addiction of the smartphone actually does to families and communities, and some of the other effects of their technology. So I'm concerned about that. I think that we need to stress ethics, and like we basically need a cultural revolution of stressing ethics and morality again, because we've lost touch with it. Uh, our institutions are so corrupted in so many different ways. And a lot of it is based on greed, in this idea that nobody's holding me to anything. I'm not being overseen. And that person's doing it, so I'm going to do it. And it's just the way things are, whatever. Um, and so we see what I just described, that breed of intelligence in Silicon Valley. And then we see another breed of basically sociopathic, narcissistic, psychopathic intelligence for success on Wall Street and in fintech, financial technology. So a lot of the people who are most successful, other people look at and say, well, to get to a position of success, I need to basically not consider the effects of my actions in the social sense. I just need to consider it in the immediate sense of income, or pursuing some abstract goal. Like this is ultimately what I think we need to realize is um, a large portion of the population, I don't know what number exactly, but is less intelligent. It's, I mean, you could probably look at it as a bell curve. Like, so you're going to have extremes on either end, and then a bunch of average, right? But less lower than average, that's 50% of the population. So you have to say that there's going to be a lot of people who are probably going to not understand much. They're not going to be too intellectually sophisticated. And we live in an increasingly, we've always lived in a complex world, but we're realizing it now. And people just aren't going to be able to handle the complexity of it. It's not, we used to think that knowledge was defined by books, and there were gatekeepers to knowledge. And now we realize that we're realizing that knowledge is infinite, and it's interconnected. It's networked, like the internet, where you have these links everywhere. So knowledge is infinitely large, and every single thing, whether it's government or taxes, or companies that people engage with, or regulations, all these things are super complex. And if you only have um, highly intelligent people designing these things in a distant, sealed off area, if you look at some regulations that come out, and it's like thousands and thousands of pages of legal jargon, and how do you comply with abstract, I mean, we all understand at a base level murder and rape and theft, but how is somebody who's less intelligent supposed to manage in a society that is so complex and dominated by and maintained for people who are the technocrats, who are the most intelligent? And I think they need to realize that they share a society with a vast swath of people, and that aren't all like them. And that doesn't mean they can just be a supremacist and say, this is this works for me, screw everybody else. um, I I think that basically the answer lies in having a universal basic income, having time banking, which, if you haven't heard about it, is uh, okay, so if you lose your job, like if you're a coal miner, and coal mining has a certain threshold of intelligence where, like, you know, people have been trying to say, oh, just retrain coal miners to be coders. It doesn't work that way. Like if the the work that is now existing that replaces a lot of these things and that automates these jobs away is higher, it has a higher intelligence threshold, and it's located, if the jobs are located elsewhere in the country, and if the job now requires a college degree, and there are just altogether fewer jobs because of people say, oh, well, now there's just going to be robot jobs, like jobs of repairing robots. Yeah, but those are going to be jobs that go to a smaller number of people, and they're going to be like electromechanical slash computer engineers. So yes, they're going to be new jobs. They're going to be fewer and more cognitively loaded and elsewhere. So um, a lot of people are going to be left without purpose. A lot of people are going to turn to opioids. A lot of people are going to become depressed. A lot of people are going to be just up shit creek, and they're going to feel that nobody cares about them. I think that we need to emphasize that we do have a common humanity, and that people do care about you, and that basically what time banking is a system. It could be an app that people can upload different tasks that need to be done on, and you get like a token. It's gamification of going out and community service. Like, I don't think that just having a universal basic income of, okay, here you go, although I think it's a great idea that it's universal, it destigmatizes it, it covers, allows people to keep their head above the water, allows people to basically spend it as needed rather than constraining it for a specific purpose. um, Effectively having a universal basic income doesn't actually give people a sense of purpose. It just says, here's this money, just don't bother us. So with time banking, it would allow people to feel like they've not only earned their UBI, but have contributed to society. One of the big complaints by libertarians, and this is justifiable, is that we've and conservatives too, I think, is that we've social fabric is frayed. And by the way, liberals, progressives too, but more so, this is on the right. Social fabric is frayed, and there used to be something called civic society, where all of these organizations, whether it was bowling leagues and sports teams and Rotary Club and religious organizations and whatever people were involved with in their free time, they were the fabric of society that allowed people to engage, and that enriched people's lives and were the nucleus of what community was. And then large government programs, social programs came in and basically said, like, no, these are our domains, like poverty and drug use and things like that. And uh, this idea of time banking would allow people to reinvest in their sense of community, and it would use technology too. So it's not only uh, focusing on the real world community and in making connections between people, which is good for them. It's good for them, it's good for society, but it also advances people's familiarity with technology, and it could potentially be used to uh, give people some rewards, like, hey, if you've done this many tasks, you get some type of reward from this company or organization or whatever. I don't know. It's an interesting idea. It can take different forms. If it takes the dystopian form, it becomes like Chinese social credit system, which is, I think that's been in an episode of Black Mirror too. But so UBI and time banking, as well as okay. So about how I'm concerned about how you run a democracy if people effectively don't understand what it is they're voting on, and what implications that can have. Because I think a lot of people um, who are less intelligent prefer is authoritarian systems that effectively tell them what to do, because it's more burdensome. I think if you're less intelligent, it's more burdensome to have to think through intense nuance and complexity. So you just say, I just want to outsource this. I want somebody else to think for me. I would rather be led. Um, I would rather be a follower than a leader. And I would rather choose somebody who's like strong and projects a certain image, and I'll just follow them. And so like if we want to, so like liberty is almost in a sense like a luxury of thinkers. You know, like a lot of people, when I say thinkers, I tend to mean people who are more on the upper end of the intelligence distribution. And so when I say that, what I mean is like it's an abstract concept, and a lot of people actually are terrified by the idea of freedom because they have no idea what to do with it. And it actually like makes them worse off, rather than like if they're structured, if society is structured in a way that allows them to sort of be on rails and to not stray too far and make bad decisions. So like I'm not advocating for like a nanny state by any means, but what I'm saying is like, and I think the founding fathers realized this, is like large groups of people will vote for a dictatorial type government if it means that they have to like think less and life is easier on them in that regard. So I think that it's fundamental that the people at the higher end of the intelligence distribution make sure that the people at the lower end of the distribution are effectively taken care of, and they have basic like food and shelter, basic essentials, and not only that, but above that, because there was this belief that, oh, if you have food and shelter or whatever, then like that's happiness and you're covered. It's like, no, there's like, it's kind of, I think Maslow's hierarchy has been discredited, but like there's layers above that. Like you can climb above that. You have esteem and belongingness and relationships, and then you self-actualize. But if you allow those people, the thing about welfare in the past is that it just gave people something, and it didn't give people a sense of like, oh, I earned this or I have purpose. It just was like depressing, and people would turn to drug use, and then people would be like, oh, well, see, this people, they get money and they just spend it on drugs or whatever. Like, of course, some people are just going to spend it on drugs regardless, but I think a lot of people are just downright depressed that it's like, hey, here's this thing that you have to spend in this very specific way, and you don't have to do anything for it, but here it is, and it has a stigma associated with it and everything. So I think that we need to allow people a feeling that they have earned their income, and make sure that that income is effectively capable of being spent in many different ways. And with time banking, I think that people will be effectively able to, people on the lower half of the intelligence distribution will feel that, they're able to contribute and to say that they have earned, which will allow them to self-actualize and to feel good about themselves, which is important for everyone. I think it's also important for the people on the upper end of the distribution to be able to effectively experiment with their creativity. You know what I mean? Like a society that overly constrains the people at the top of the distribution is like a Soviet state, where they say like, nope, everybody needs, like the top people need to be held down. Everybody needs to be equal effectively. People aren't equal. I think that we need to realize that people ought to be treated equally ethically, but people aren't physically equal. So the idea that people are equal under the eyes of God got translated into people are equal under the eyes of the law when we switched from Christianity to liberalism. And now we're in this place where it's kind of like this progressive view or like, I don't know, maybe pseudo-Marxist view where people are equal or ought to be made equal. And it's like, you can't really make people equal. You just have to allow them to pursue happiness in their own ways, as long as like basic rules are followed, like you don't murder someone or you don't rape somebody or steal from them. So I think that the people at the upper and lower ends of the intelligence distribution need to be accounted for, and then you get a more balanced society. But um, one of the ways that this can also be helpful is that we're realizing that the old lines that we used to draw no longer actually hold. Like, it's not like all smart people are white, all dumb people are black, all smart people are Asian or Jewish, dumb people are Hispanic, whatever. Like, these old tropes are like, no, there are smart people and less smart people in every group, really. And so you have, there's no looking through these imprecise, crude prisms. There are still going to be people who do that, and I've talked in the Daryl Davis episode about how I think people who are more at the lower end of the intelligence distribution are still going to like, they're not going to say, oh yeah, you know, I'm at the lower end of the distribution. They're going to look for people to scapegoat, and they're going to look, some of them, and look for people who are less than them or lower than them, and really like, and that's what I think has contributed largely towards the views of Black people in the South, is of white people, Southern white people, who were uh, kind of um, effectively made fun of or made to feel inferior because of coastal northern elitist white people had to find somebody to put beneath them, and that's sort of the structure that we live with. So we have to be mindful that, like, although intelligence is going to take over as the primary dividing line, the old bogeymen are still going to be there. They're just going to be, in my eyes, um, more inferior to the larger dividing line of intelligence. And something that I mentioned, or that I forgot to mention earlier, is actually related to generations. I think that that is going to be a massive dividing line moving forward too. And the reason why that's going to be a dividing line is because generational change is occurring more and more rapidly. And that's particularly driven by technology, obviously. Our morals, our ethics, our social institutions, our laws, everything cannot keep up with the pace of technology. We're sort of living under this illusion, this weird suspended animation where our old documents like the Constitution, which, by the way, I revere the Constitution. I'm not a Woodrow Wilson who's like, yeah, this is just garbage, it's standing in our way. I think we ought to respect it, but we ought to also realize that the world we occupy right now is vastly, vastly different. And if we're trying to like interpret our world through the lens of the Constitution, there's going to be like this very, very awkward mismatch of the world we live in is not like the world of the late 1700s. It has changed in enormous ways, and it's only going to change more. So we definitely need some new amendments. But I think that, so the reason I bring this up is because, why did I bring this up? It's getting a little late. Oh, generational change. This is when I know it's getting close to wrapping up. So with generational change, if you think about how, I don't know, various listeners, which generation you're in, whether it's a boomer or Gen X or millennial or Z, but you think about how difficult it is to relate to the generation that came just before you. It's going to be, the generations are effectively going to shrink, where technology is going to advance so rapidly that time is going to dilate, going to compress, and it might be extremely difficult for a millennial to relate to a boomer. It's moving forward going to become extremely difficult for a millennial and a Z to be able to relate to each other, and then a Z to relate to whatever comes next, and then generations are traditionally measured in 20-year spans. It's going to become smaller and smaller and smaller, where like each year is going to be, if you are in the years of your life that really establish your character, um, during a year where so much is occurring and the news cycle is presenting all this information, slash the internet is presenting all this information, and technology is changing rapidly, you're probably not going to be able to relate too well to somebody that comes a couple years later than you, and that's when their formative years are occurring. So it's going to be incumbent upon us, for a sense of continuity, to maintain conversations and interactions with generations that are older and younger than us. Like, if our society is going to have any sense of continuity, we're going to have to keep engaging, and we're going to have to not hold it against people who are older than us for not understanding what we grew up with and we take for granted, and explain technological change, and make it less terrifying, basically, for older people. And older people need to not hold what younger people have access to and what motivates them against them in return. And so I think that is how we effectively maintain cohesion in society. Um, the thing that I forgot to mention with the different degrees of intelligence, going back a sec, is how I don't see how you can have democracy actually work in reality if you have a vast amount of people who don't understand the complexity, who are voting on something so complex anyway, who are told that it's your patriotic duty to vote. Like, maybe the understanding ought to be that people who are at the higher end of the intelligence spectrum ought to be able to, or need to effectively take on a culture of, we are in these positions. We basically, it's like a superpower, and it's going to be like Uncle Ben. With great power comes great responsibility, and with your power is the responsibility to take care of people that don't have your power, to watch out for them, and to make sure that they're not living immiserated lives. So if that is the form that our democracy is going to take moving forward, then the more intelligent people, the more capable feeling people ought to be the ones that vote. And the people who really are on the lower end of the distribution ought to be encouraged effectively not to vote on things that they don't understand. And I know that sounds extremely like, I don't know, elitist or anti-democratic or something, but think about it. It's like, how do you have somebody voting on something as complex as the modern government? And we, like, the people on the higher end of the distribution, they need to make sure that the things that they come up with are understandable to a much, much wider range of the population. Like, the fact that we have a tax code that's thousands and thousands of pages long, like, it really ought to be reduced to something that is easily understandable. And the same thing with most regulations. We need, by the way, fewer lawyers in government. A lot, like 70% of government is lawyers. We need a wider range of occupations represented in government. The revolving door ought to be reconsidered, where somebody leaves government work in a regulatory agency and joins the industry they just regulated, or vice versa. A lot of these things need to be done. And by the way, another thing related to the democratic process and intelligence is jury pools, right? Like, think about how many people have been put away for crimes that they didn't commit because the jury was not intelligent enough to comprehend effectively. Like a jury of your peers and a representative jury, I don't really, that seems like an illusion to me. Like if you are, even in a case like murder, which is like theoretically one of the more clear cut conceptually crimes, there are so many details to keep track of, and people who really are intelligent are likely to be led and influenced by demagogues, just like in the political process. Lawyers who basically, whoever tells the best story, who puts on the best showmanship, and they're not going to, less intelligent people aren't going to be thinking about what the actual facts are and the details are and what's irrelevant, but good showmanship. And similarly, I personally think that we absolutely ought to start persecuting white collar crime. But how the hell are you going to have a jury of people who are on the lower end of some people, at least, who are on the lower end of the intelligence distribution, judging whether somebody committed an extremely complex financial crime? It's just not possible. Like you would have to have a jury composed, and by the way, the jury of your peers, I don't know if that means a jury of a greater cross-section of the population, or a jury of people just chosen to be pretty much like you or of your profession or whatever. But let's say you have a jury of your peers. If you're convicted or accused of a white collar crime, and you have a jury of your peers in the sense of you have other, I don't know, investment bankers, all investment bankers on the jury, aren't, although they might be in like the most intelligently equipped to deal with what the crime this person is being accused of, what it actually consisted of, and they understand it, they would also probably, if that person does effectively what these people do, be more inclined to forgive them and say, oh, this is just part of the profession. Like you need to have intelligence and ethics simultaneously, which is a big ask, but we need to recombine intelligence and morality in people who are high achievers and people who are highly ethical, highly moral. And some people say, no, that's impossible, because once you blanket somebody with moral obligation, then they're inherently less likely to be able to, they can't compete. How is somebody who has moral principles able to compete with somebody who has no moral principles and can do whatever they want? My point is, we need to start thinking about these things. And there's no obvious, clear answers, but there needs to be cultural change. And we need to acknowledge that intelligence is important and that intelligence is not knowledge. Otherwise, we're going to keep taking advantage of people who are on the lower end of the intelligence spectrum, and we're going to say, hey, your ticket to the American dream, you need to keep consuming, you need to keep searching for meaning in your life by buying more and more, by buying a home, which leads to the '08 financial crisis. You need to find the American dream by getting a college education. Huge housing bubble, student debt right now. We need to basically give people resources, not everything, but a basic level of resources, and allow people a path to finding their own meaning. And then I don't know if it will happen this way exactly, but there's something to be said for maybe if people are able to and encouraged to find their own meaning in life, their individual meaning, and see where it overlaps with other people's, then there will be less of a search for grand narrative meaning like only the Democrats are right, only the Republicans are right, only the Christians are right, Muslims, Jews, Nazis, communists, liberals, whatever. All these grand narratives that cause massive. Only the Americans are right. Only the Chinese are right. You know what I'm talking about. I'm hoping that if we think about all these things, there will be less of that. So anyway, that's it for tonight. That was a lot to think about, and I'm hoping that you're with me on some of that. If I'm way off on other bits of it, please let me know. I apologize for the moments where my brain wasn't working and when I was just basically trying to think for solid 10 seconds, but it's been a long day. I just wanted to make sure that I got this out on Wednesday as promised, my general release date. So wrapping back to the beginning of the episode, I just really want to thank you for listening for the past year, and more to come. There are going to be really interesting connections, really interesting people on. A lot of these themes that I talked about in this episode will be talked about in future episodes at numerous points. So join the conversation. And last thing, somebody was asking the other day, well, what does man versus mob actually mean? To me, what it means is the freedom to have a dissenting opinion and to not have people crush you for it. To say, I actually don't agree with what you just said. To hear somebody who's passionate about something and to have the balls to say, I understand your passion, but that's actually not true. And effectively to stand up to authoritarianism, to public shaming, to still have a sense of morality. I'm not saying to do this for anything, but to do it when you feel like you know that you're right or that your position ought to be considered. So that's what Man vs. Mob is about. So to that end, I encourage you to do that as much as possible and to network through this podcast, to join the conversation, to introduce as many of your friends and relatives to this as possible, and to effectively network minds together. That's what this is about, is to join ideas that never would have been joined before. If you're not, I'm a reader, but if you're not a reader, what my goal is to take the things that I read and to inject them into the podcast so that you can engage with them. And we'll see all the crazy new ideas that come out of this. This is really a social experiment. It is a podcast. I know podcasts are kind of mundane and everybody's got one now and it's a saturated market, but a lot of interesting things can happen. And this isn't my podcast where I say, I control this. This is an open source public project. Everybody, please contribute. If you have critiques, if you have comments, if you have topics that you want to recommend, whatever it is, please do. Tell people about it. And hey, subscribe if you would like on the website, nanbymobpodcast.com. Leave a review. That would be much appreciated on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. Leave a comment on YouTube. Try to participate in this. I post stuff on LinkedIn too. I have a LinkedIn kind of website page just for Man v. Mob. I also have a Minds account. Minds is another social network. And I'm hoping to get involved in ThinkSpot too. So that's all I've got. Stay engaged, and I'll see you next week. Good night, everybody.